This is Modern Political Philosophy, technically Friday, April 22nd. But because it's Passover and because convocation has bled into the academic life of the college and the surrounding of following classes, we're not meeting tomorrow. So it's actually Thursday morning. But it's, if you close your eyes and spin and click your heels and spin around 3 times, it's actually Friday morning. So here's what I'm going to do in this recorded lecture. Yesterday, when we were discussing Locke, we actually took the bulk of the period to talk about your paper responses to the death of Stalin and Lockean philosophy. And so I had meant to kind of move on with an introduction to Rousseau and talking about his context and introducing the 2 works that we're going to consider of Rousseau. The Discourse on Inequality, published in 1755. We'll talk more about some of the sequence of his publications. And The Social Contract. And in some ways, the Discourse on Inequality lays out Rousseau's theory of nature, and the Social Contract lays out his political teaching. So there, in some ways, these 2 works considered together sort of form correspond to, say, chapter 13 in Leviathan and chapter 14 and then part 2 of Leviathan, or broadly part 1 in Leviathan, which is the nature of man and the nature of nature, and part 2, Hobbes's political teaching. In the same way, the second treatise of Locke can be kind of divided between chapters 1 through 8, which is his understanding of human nature and the state of nature, and then 9 through 18, which is his political teaching. In the same way, you can kind of use these 2 works of Rousseau to do the same thing. Now, I also passed out yesterday the first chapter of an interesting book by Paul Johnson. Paul Johnson is a British historian of ideas and general historian, remarkably prolific. I think he's passed away by now. He's probably 800 years old now. Actually, he's probably in his late 90s if he's still alive. I actually am not sure myself. And he has a great book called Intellectuals, which I used as the basis of a special topics course called Jerks, Fraud, Hypocrites, and Monsters. Now, the premise of this book is that in the modern world, people turn to intellectuals and ideology for the same source, purpose, and support for their personal and political identities that they turn to religion and priestly castes before, and that the modern intellectual is a kind of a substitution of the ancient philosopher and priest. And there's some truth to this, by the way. Ideology is to modern life what religion was to ancient life, and that ideologies can be as potent and as all-encompassing as ancient religions. Just look at Nazism in Nazi Germany, which meant to be an all-encompassing and explanatory ideology with intense and fanatic devotion, and Marxism, communism within the Marxist societies, which is meant to be an all-encompassing and explanatory and emotional and political total absorption into life. So the premise that in modern life ideology replaces what religion supplied in antiquity, there's something to that. So the premise of Johnson's book is a kind of a series of personal autobiographies plus a presentation of the teaching of major intellectuals who've really shaped the world that we live in, both literary, philosophic, and otherwise. And his first character that he picks is Rousseau. And this chapter is quite interesting. I'm not requiring it for you to read it, but I will refer to it and quote from it a bit because it provides not only interesting fascination. Rousseau is a very complicated character. And the premise of this chapter is that it kind of dubbed. So, by the way, for this lecture, you should have the notes attached from yesterday. So the function of this lecture is to sort of lay out Rousseau, the nature of his teaching, and in some ways to serve as an introduction to the second discourse. And then next week we'll finish up with the second discourse and the social contract. So in my notes I state, and under Jean Jacques Rousseau, Europe's first celebrity philosopher, and then I put in parentheses after Voltaire. It's important to remember, so Rousseau was born in 1712, died in 1778, so clearly a creature of the 18th century and one of its major influences. Johnson refers to the cult of Rousseau. And that's why I referred to the fact that Rousseau was one of the first philosophic celebrities. But really, Voltaire was. And it might be helpful to put in context, both for understanding the celebrity of both Voltaire, who was an old man when Rousseau was beginning to be widely read and influential. In fact, as you're going to see, Voltaire, who's always a funny guy. If you read Candide, Voltaire was a classic Enlightenment intellectual, kind of devoted to Locke, to Descartes, to science, and to rationality, and to the spread of the political culture based on rights and consent and rationality. And when he read the second treatise of Rousseau, he says, I have never met an author who so persuasively attempts to persuade us to get down on all fours and crawl back into the caves. Unfortunately, at the age of 80, I'm such an old man, I just can't shed the old habit of walking on two legs. That was Voltaire's kind of quippish dismissal of the broad Rousseauian call to return to nature. More about that in our later discussion. But Rousseau really was Voltaire really was a French intellectual celebrity. And so just a little bit of the historical context. Machiavelli published in 1513. Descartes published in 1637. Hobbes published in 1651. Locke in 1688. Montesquieu, by the way, 1733, whom I've referred to several times in our discussions as the reformulator of Lockeanism, that if you had to say who the philosophical grandparents of the American regime were, it'd be both Locke and Montesquieu. But then the French. So what's happened to the movement unleashed by these modern thinkers so far in the 1700s? 1733 isn't only the publication of Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws, which lays out a kind of a reformulated Lockean constitutionalism. Remember, in our previous discussions, I mentioned that Locke created the idea of the separation of powers, in some ways checks and balances, although that's more of an American fine-tuning of the Lockean idea of separation of powers. Consult Madison, Federalist 51, to see the American refinement of separation of powers, but through the lens of Montesquieu. And as I mentioned, Locke's three separated powers were legislative, executive, and federative. Montesquieu, I think, thought it through a little bit more and said, if the purpose of separation of powers is, in Montesquieu's term, Locke defines tyranny as absolute power. Montesquieu's definition, which is actually quoted by Madison in Federalist 47, says tyranny is the concentration of all power in one set of hands. And in some ways, if you think, what's the constitutional protection of the separation of powers? It's to prevent all power collapsing into one set of hands, individual, and therefore that person assuming, or set of persons assuming a godlike power over other human beings, which actually renders all of us bestial, as we saw in the death of Stalin. So Montesquieu understood that if the aim is to enable government to govern and yet be protected against the kind of tyranny that turns citizens into cringing ninnies, you had to separate the judicial from the executive, because the power to arrest and punish, and the power to impose punishment, which is one of the things the judicial power does, Montesquieu understood better to separate those two things out as separate functions, and that will actually make the government safer. And I have to say that Montesquieuian instinct proved to be the case in subsequent ideological tyrannies, both in communism, in the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic, and all Marxist societies, and in Nazism, because the first institution to go in modern ideological tyrannical states was the independent judiciary. So Montesquieu had, I think, the right instinct. What about the foreign affairs power, the federative power? Montesquieu divides that up between the legislative and executive power, and that's our constitutional founders followed that. That's why the president's commander-in-chief with the war power, but the Congress has the power to declare war. The president negotiates treaties, but the Senate ratifies them. So we really follow the Montesquieuian reiteration of the separation of powers by legislative, executive, and judicial, with the foreign affairs power that Locke talks about as the federative power split between the Congress and the president. So, to go back then to the overall unfolding of the Enlightenment, we have been, because this is a course in modern political philosophy, we've been following the unfolding and the internal dialogue within modern political thinkers. But we also read Descartes, and we also saw that Hobbes, and even Locke, and certainly Spinoza and Bacon, whom we didn't read in this class, Bacon and Spinoza, they all embrace the power of science to reform human consciousness into rational mastery of self and nature and of society. And the political teaching that we saw emerge in Hobbes and Locke is really an attempt to apply this notion of modern science to the political realm. But you'd have to say that at the same time that this strand of political thought is unfolding, and it really develops three branches, by the way. The kind of Anglo-British, Anglo-American strand of the Enlightenment. So let's call it the Enlightenment, because that's really what the people involved in this movement from about 1650 on called itself, that it was a period of enlightenment. And Voltaire, as I mentioned, expressly understood the world to be going through a period of enlightenment, in which he understood himself to be a major literary and philosophic agent. And then the three strands of the Enlightenment. So there's this British strand, this English strand, Locke, Sidney, etc. And then there's a kind of continental French and German strand, first reflected in Voltaire and Diderot as the French version of the Lockean principles of enlightenment, and in some ways Descartes already, and eventually to be reflected, the Enlightenment sort of moves on the continent from the French thinkers, and especially Rousseau, to the German thinkers, Kant, Hegel, and Marx, and Nietzsche. And so the Enlightenment and modern political philosophy sort of starts to branch geographically out, sort of the British tradition, the English tradition, and that sort of becomes the major Anglo-American tradition. The continental tradition, first French, then German, and then the Scottish Enlightenment with David Hume and Adam Smith and others, Hutchinson. They kind of follow a parallel, interesting tradition, and in some ways, America is a product more of the sort of dominant Anglo tradition, English tradition, modified by some aspects of the French and Scottish Enlightenment. So, on one level, the three branches of the Enlightenment, you could say. And let me just say that because of the printing press, because of the spread of travel and everything, all these three dimensions of the Enlightenment were always in communication with each other. And David Hume had a profound influence on the continent, and so did Locke, for that matter. But there is a certain sense in which you could say, in a broad kind of intellectual history stroke, that because of the radical inequalities on the continent, because the French Bourbon monarchy from the 16 to 1700s was the closest thing to a Western European version of the Tsarist state. And the radical inequalities of wealth between the aristocracy and the peasantry and the rest of the population, which became stark in Russia and led to the absolutism and the state police of the Tsar, which, here's an interesting thought experiment, that the more radical the injustices and inequalities of the aristocratic royal absolutism and society of Europe in general, the world actually, became more radical both in Russia and France, and the revolutions to depose those orators and the philosophic thought that undergird it moved towards a much more radical rejection of conventional arrangements, both economic, social, political, and religious, as opposed to the Anglo-American tradition, which even though England, and Scotland for that matter, but England especially, went through real turmoil, first with the rise of Puritanism, which was the kind of British version of radical Protestantism, as evinced by Calvin and other thinkers on the continent, and the Anglican Church was kind of the more institutional and traditional Reformed Church, say in Lutheranism, but and so England did undergo its struggles. But you'd have to say that the English monarchy, even though it had reached radical authority under Henry VIII and a moderate authority under Elizabeth I, and yet it moved towards this royal absolutism. And the English Revolution kind of in 1641 to 1649 and the restoration of the monarchy, somehow England managed to avoid the absolutism of royal authority, as reflected in the Bourbon monarchy, the Louis, and the Tsarist regime. And there's another commonality that we'll see in a second, by the way, and I'll come back to that, and that is the rise of massive instruments of bureaucratic administration and state police, the secret state police. Both the Tsar and the Bourbon monarchy developed those things. Because, of course, there were restive revolutionary movements within them. The English political system always kind of had a moderation to it, and that might be reflected in the political philosophers that it produced, especially the Lockeanism and Algernon Sidney, other British Republicans, that kind of led to the more moderate political philosophy of a Locke. So, in some ways, the background of both Voltaire and Rousseau, our main object of attention, is the French Enlightenment, and you could say that's with Montesquieu and etc. And so, but Voltaire is like a French-speaking Locke, and represents high classicism both in philosophy, literature, and etc. And but let's be clear, and this is kind of background not only for Rousseau as a philosophic celebrity, given the nature of French intellectualism, back to that in a minute, but you have to remember then, the political and cultural revolutions of the Enlightenment were paralleled by the unfolding scientific revolution made possible by Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And you'd have to say basically the same year, almost the same time that Locke published his second treatise, the greatest scientific formulation since ancient times was being promulgated and spread, and that was, of course, the publication of Isaac Newton's Modern Physics in the Principia Mathematica in 1687. This was like an atomic bomb of scientific revelation that spread through European life and culture. And it led to, in some ways, the development of the instruments of modern science in practice. I mean, Descartes says in the last chapter of the Discourse on Method, part 6, that he has to have captains who follow him. Well, there was the Lavoisier, the discoverer of oxygen, and in other words, the philosophers, scientists who followed after Descartes, like Newton and others, did in fact begin to accelerate a combination of technological and scientific advances, so that by the late 1700s, and in our country, by the way, reflected in Benjamin Franklin, who was an amateur but not inconsequential scientist, and part of the influence that Ben Franklin had on America and the world was a kind of notion of the advancement of science. You all know the idea with the kite, the key, and the electricity in the jar and everything. Plus the microwave in the back kitchen, and so what's the critical intersection of the scientific revolution and human life? 1733, ironically, also the same year that Montesquieu published The Spirit of Laws, and that was in England. Arkwright built the first steam-powered factory, and that, of course, is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which marked all kinds of things. That's also the background for Marx, as you're going to see, but clearly at that point, by the mid 1700s, scientific progress and discoveries beginning to seep in to transform human life, and you're going to see that's the backdrop of Rousseau's first discourse on the progress in the arts and sciences. Well, and I'll come back to that and talk about that more. But on the cult of philosophic celebrity, I think Johnson is right that there was never a philosophic celeb in his own time who had such extreme influence within his own lifetime and was feted by the same aristocracy that he often despised and made fun of. and I'll lay out his other influence in other parts of life that still continue today. But Johnson's very good on this. So again, even though it's not assigned reading, I think if you have a spare 40 minutes over the next 300 years, you might want to look through that first chapter. It's well written, and it tells you a lot of interesting and bizarre things about Rousseau as an individual and as a celebrity. But let's talk about intellectual celebrity. There's no doubt that in some ways each nationality has its own characteristic, and the French have always loved their ideas. Americans love their toilet paper and cars. The English love their tea. The Germans love accurate timepieces so that they can be punctual, and the Russians love their vodka, etc., etc., etc. The French love their ideas, and they're an idea-intoxicated people. And to some degree, the idea that by the mid-1700s, that much of public society, and for instance, in terms of the spread of Enlightenment ideas, you should look up in intellectual history, like for instance, the rise of the salon. And French women actually became an important, critical, and significant element in the spread of Enlightenment ideas, because the French aristocratic women would actually, who were also beautifully educated and remarkably profound and influential, would often hold. I know it sounds funny to say evening parties would be so socially and intellectually influential, but this is how many of these ideas spread, and many of the most influential individuals in French society, intellectual society, were women through the institution of the salon, so the evening party. But it's important to remember, when we started talking about Machiavelli and Descartes and Hobbes, about writing carefully, because do you remember the Cartesian image that while you're tearing down your old house and building the new one, you have to remember you're still living under the old roof. The religious and political powers of Europe were not yet quite willing to allow full freedom of speech. As I said, in some ways, although you'll see in the paragraph I'm about to read from Johnson's book, there were little glimpses of atheism before Marx. The first real open, Ludwig Feuerbach, who was an immediate forerunner of Marx, was an explicit atheist. But it wasn't safe to advocate explicitly atheism, so you had to be careful about what you wrote. But also politically. Remember, Hobbesian, Lockean, Montesquieuian Enlightenment thought undermines the very claims of authority of royalty and an aristocracy, because royalty is based on divine right or whatever, and aristocracy is based on natural superiority. So in some ways, the subversive quality of the emergent modern thought wasn't subtle, and therefore the French intellectual scene was both a kind of an interesting dialogue between expression and repression. So let me read from page 6 of Johnson's chapter on Rousseau to kind of set the stage for our turning to Rousseau. The power of the French intellectuals, this is on page 6 of what I sent out, was just beginning and was to increase steadily in the second half of the century. But in the 1740s and 1750s, their position as critics of society was still precarious. The state, when it felt itself threatened, was liable to turn on them with sudden ferocity. Rousseau later loudly complained of the persecution he suffered, and he did suffer persecution. He had to flee France because he was a persona non grata to the French aristocracy and royalty and the church. But in fact, he had to put up with much less than most of his contemporaries. Voltaire was publicly caned. Just a second. That was modern technology interrupting my lecture, my video computer recorded lecture, that, as you're going to see, Rousseau thinks is stealing all of our souls. Good. I'm glad the phone rang during my lecture, because it makes exactly the point that Rousseau is going to make in the first discourse and in the second discourse. All the modern improvements in technology and material progress are actually making us more comfortable, but more miserable at the same time. And more about that later. So we become slaves to our cell phones. And I have to say, as much as I love students and young people, when I look at you being unable to tear yourself away from this device, I see Rousseau might have a point. And let me just say, I don't agree with all the thinkers we're reading. And in fact, I think some of these thinkers unleashed terrible suffering on humanity with the problematic dimensions of their thought and ideology. And it's important to remember at this point in a course on modern political philosophy and in philosophy that no human mind can encompass all of the reality of human and cosmological life. And just because you think somebody has gotten it basically wrong, or whose thought leads to unintended consequences, perhaps most of our thought leads to unintended consequences. I had a professor of political philosophy who said, you have to measure political philosophy by how it affects the behavior of the people who have the guns in their hands. And so in some ways, the sobering thing is perhaps all thought has consequences that we can't be aware of when put into practice. There is, in fact, a difference between theory and practice. But specifically on Rousseau and, say, Marx and Nietzsche, I'm in profound disagreement with much of their thought. But having said that, you can't deny that these great minds did understand things and saw into the human condition and saw, in some ways, the emergent modern condition. Now, as you're going to see, and as Cropsey suggests in the article that we read, these subsequent thinkers try to correct the defects of their prior thinkers by accepting their concepts and radicalizing them. So remember, the cure may be worse than the disease. The solution may be more problematic than the original problem. And so bear that in mind as we move through Rousseau, Marx, and Nietzsche to finish this course off. But I do want to say that these are the brilliant minds of the human race. They're Rousseau in some ways, and Kant, and Hegel, and Marx, and Nietzsche, and Locke, all of them, all the ones we've read and will read. They are as brilliant as Isaac Newton, and so in some ways, it's a privilege to be able to read these authors. Even when you disagree with them, you have to see their insight. And so Rousseau's notion that the more materially sophisticated, urban, and comfortable and technologically we become, the emptier, miserable, and more, and let's use Rousseau's term that we're going to have to explore. This is the central diagnosis for Rousseau for both the ills of human beings in civil society, but especially modern technological materialist society. The term is alienation, and we will spend much of our energy exploring why Rousseau thinks the worst thing that happens to human beings in comfortable modern technological societies, they become alienated, and Fremdung in German, from themselves. They become strangers to themselves and to the people around them, and become empty vessels of misery, yes, in nice clothes, in air-conditioned comfort, and with a screen in front of their face, at the same time that they became empty and unhappy vessels. So we'll explore that in Rousseau's thought. But to get back to our topic. I was reading from page 6 of the Johnson text, and the point I'm reading is we have to remember, I'm using this reference for two things: to explore the cult of philosophic celebrity that exploded around Rousseau, but it was also preceded by Voltaire. But at the same time, don't forget, the power of the church and state was still essentially in control of society. So these authors wrote at their own peril, and that meant they had to write carefully, and sometimes you might say esoterically, and sometimes they suffered. Remember, Hobbes had to flee England after the publication of Leviathan because he was accused of atheism, which was probably right, even though he hid it well in the Leviathan. Locke was more careful, always wrote as a Christian, and to some degree, France was always a little more daring. So to finish the paragraph, Voltaire was publicly caned by the servants of an aristocrat he had offended, and served nearly a year in the Bastille. Those who sold forbidden books might get 10 years in the galleys. In July of 1749, Diderot was arrested and put in solitary confinement in the Vincennes fortress for publishing a book defending atheism. He was there for 3 months. Vincennes, Rousseau visited him there, And while walking on the road to Vincennes, he saw in the paper a notice for the Dijon Academy of Letters and fine tasting mustard, inviting entries for an essay competition on the theme, "Whether the rebirth of the sciences and the arts has contributed to the improvement of morals." This episode, which occurred in 1750, was the turning point in Rousseau's life. So you can follow Johnson's account of Rousseau's life and everything. But here's a post note on Voltaire. So yes, he was punished and everything, but at the same time, especially Candide, his very funny novel about positive philosophy, born of the aftermath of the Lisbon earthquake that devastated Lisbon and sent a shudder of pessimism throughout Europe and European intellectual society. But yet was followed by a kind of wave of religious optimism that even though bad things happen, it's all in God's plan. And the secular German philosophy, quasi-secular, Leibniz, contemporary of Newton, by the way. And both Leibniz and Newton are contest for the designation of the founders of the calculus. So both Newton and Leibniz were brilliant men. But Leibniz was also known as a philosopher and a political philosopher who argued that even though evil exists in this world, it's for the better. And he coined the phrase, "It's the best of all possible worlds." Voltaire, in his savagely funny novel Candide, satirizes this notion because it glosses over the reality of evil and is an attempt to escape from it without actually dealing with it. So Voltaire himself, when he died in his 80s, was a philosophic celebrity. When he died, thousands of people accompanied his casket to the grave. So he was a philosophic celebrity. But Rousseau was in some ways the first great truly philosophic celebrity who was celebrated in aristocratic salons throughout France and the rest of Europe, in Switzerland. And as you're going to see if you read the Johnson book, but also that's the point I'll try to make now, he became, in his own time and immediately right after, one of the most influential philosophers of all time. So, what kind of influence? If you're looking at the notes under Roman numeral 2 from Wednesday, first of all, philosophic influence. What major aspects of the rethinking of the emergent modern tradition of Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke is Rousseau known for? Remember, when we turned to Locke from Hobbes, we saw Locke taking more seriously the notion of a historical state of nature. And in a way, Locke argues that in order to understand how humans artificially acquired reason over the course of time is not part of their natural construction, but that changed their nature. That's why property and commerce and all that. Because for Locke, that explains the development of human distinctiveness, especially reason. So in some ways, Rousseau is going to radicalize this turn to history and the historical transformation between human beings in the state of nature and state of society that you will see laid out in the second discourse. And in fact, this becomes a critical element because Rousseau is going to argue there is no fixed human nature, that once society begins, society radically alienates us from our original natural simplicity and happiness and turns us into a different being, a malleable being. And Rousseau argues that as society, institutions, and cultures change, human nature changes with it. That doctrine is called Historicism, and that becomes the platform of both Kant and Hegel and Marx, Nietzsche, and in some ways much of modern culture. Then, so how it survives as a philosophy is the idea that every human being is a product of his or her historical culture. And that, now obviously we're all affected by the cultures we're born in, even Plato knew that. But Rousseau really argues, and his followers agree, that human nature, human being, actually radically changes from place to place and time to time. And over time, human beings become quite different beings than they were in previous ages. And that one can never escape through one's consciousness from the set of one's time. Hegel is the philosopher who's going to bring that idea to its perfection, that human consciousness and philosophic awareness advances through historical stages to a moment of perfection, which, interestingly enough, Hegel saw in himself. More about that later. but it also becomes critical to Marx and Nietzsche. So historicism, the notion that human being and consciousness is essentially historically determined and limited, and that there's an unfolding of historical consciousness. There is a certain sense in which that's tied with a kind of radicalism. Rousseau is going to take liberty and equality to their radical foundations. And you're going to see it's on this basis of the radicalization of liberty and equality that he rejects both accepts Hobbes and Locke. And both the preface to the second discourse and the second discourse, you're going to see. He's going to say explicitly, Hobbes and Locke looked for man in the state of nature, but they never found it. Instead, what they did was, unconsciously, their philosophy is tainted by a retroprojection of social traits that human beings are like in society back onto natural man. And so you're going to see the acceptance of liberty or equality, but what it means to say their radicalization, you'll see what it means. And this radical notion of human equality and liberty in the state of nature, this going to a root that takes us to an absolute beginning point in which human identity actually disappears in our natural condition, becomes the basis of. So here's what you could say: the more radically you see humans as free and equal in the state of nature, and you'll see what Rousseau means by that, the more radical the correction of society becomes. And in some ways, that's why there's an implicit radicalism to Marxism and existentialism, the last two major fusions of modern thought that are still playing themselves out in our lives. You'll see that what it means to call that radical. Let me just explain that right now. Radical means not extreme, although we use it that way in English. Radical comes from the Latin word radix, which is the Latin word for root, as in radish, or when you solve for a radical equation, or radius. So a radicalized version of an idea accepts the core of that idea, but takes it to its radical center and dispenses with any moderating influences. That's why when we say something radical, that's what we mean. It takes it to the root and becomes, it reduces the phenomenon simply to its actual center point or root, which is, you could say, well, okay, isn't that just discovering the truth? Perhaps. And that's how Rousseau definitely sees it. But it also means that any other qualifying element has to be excluded and suppressed in order to bring out the root meaning of the concept. So we'll see what that means when you apply radicalism to human society and life, not just philosophically, but politically and culturally. You'd have to say that Rousseau is not simply, but in some ways is the first formulator of what I call idealism. That human nature, since it's now quite different from it was in the state of nature, it becomes something radically different, and that there's a certain sense in which you have to reform human beings as animals and as creatures in society according to an idealized notion of reason. Now that's kind of ironic with Rousseau, because you're going to see Rousseau is going to argue, like Hobbes and Locke, that reason is artificial. Yet, Rousseau is going to argue in The Social Contract that you can transform democratic society into a kind of a radical equality which can suppress and unify people on an ideal level. He's going to call that concept the general will. So when we turn to The Social Contract, the concept of the general will, that a good society operates by formulating a general will, which is the abstract common good produced by the ideal mind of the society, and then forces or teaches every mind in that society to vibrate according to that ideal reality, that ideal commonality. Kant, probably most of you haven't read Kant, but you may be familiar with, as every philosopher has his sentence and by phrase or byword, the phrase that most people who haven't read Kant know about Kant is the categorical imperative, by which you make the measure of your personal morality. You have to expand and imagine your behavior being the general rule for all of humanity. And if you can't take your behavior and expand it to absolute generality so that it will include all rational beings and potentially all human beings, then so literally, for Kant, the ideal of what is moral is what is general and rational and abstractable to all rational creatures acting the same way. It doesn't take a linguist to see the linguistic harmony, and for that matter, you're going to see the conceptual harmony between the general will, Rousseau's phrase, and the categorical imperative. General, categorical, will, imperative. So Kant really derives the core of his moral and political philosophy from Rousseau. And you're going to see Hegel adopts this kind of idealism and then argues this is the whole thrust of dialectical history, making human beings more enlightened, more rational, more general, more universal as time goes by. Marx will accept that and reject it at the same time. So idealism in that sense. Feminism. Now we saw elements of proto-feminism in Hobbes in chapter 22 of the Leviathan when he says, people think the rule of male or female is natural, but it's just because men have always had power. And Rousseau, I'm sorry, and Locke, when he argues in chapter 6 and 7 on paternal power, that people derive the power, the absolute power of the father over his children from the act of generation, but he quietly reminds you that there it takes two to tango, and therefore mothers have as much right to be included in the power of generation and parenthood, parental power, as men. So both men and both Hobbes and Locke are proto-feminists. Rousseau has a bad rap. Don't forget, I used to be a feminist, and I in the 70s and 80s I was a feminist activist, and I've taught feminism my entire teaching career because it's been both a practical and a theoretical interest for me. And in the literature of feminism, Rousseau has a bad rap because in the Emile, which we'll talk about in a minute, he has the female character Sophie educated to domesticity. But in reality, the radicalism of Rousseau becomes a critical template because, and I'll prove it to you linguistically, the core concept underneath much of contemporary feminism and contemporary transgenderism, for that matter, is that all gender identity is socially constructed. It's artificial, generated by society, typically to impose power from one class of human beings onto another. And therefore, the artificiality of gender identity, or the social origins of gender identity, that's pure Rousseau, as you're going to see. Rousseau is going to argue all human identity is socially constructed. And we'll see that leads to the great problem of alienation from our natural selves. And then Rousseau's radical corrective for that, which is to create an artificial self, so general, so radical, so ideal, that the radical solution to the radical alienation of society is a radical resort to authority to reconstruct human identity based on socialized property, actually. Rousseau's a proto-communist, as you'll see in the second discourse, because he will make the argument that private property is theft. More about that later. And so Rousseau is critically influential upon subsequent Marxism and socialism, too, by the way. And so the concept of socially constructed identity. So Rousseau is profoundly influential philosophically, as we're going to see when we turn to the last two thinkers of our course, Marx and Nietzsche. They are in some ways post-Rousseauians. Cultural. Perhaps it's hard to say whether Rousseau's philosophic, political, or cultural influence was greater. But Romanticism, the literary, cultural, musical, artistic movement that succeeded classicism, if you've had courses on European literature or art or music, you know that Beethoven follows Haydn. And that from the Baroque music of Bach and Pachelbel, etc., to the classical musicians of Handel and Haydn, etc., the great romantic revolution in music that Beethoven introduces and becomes the chief prophet of, with the publication in 1850 performance of the Eroica, the Third Symphony, which spelled a new mood in music. And the essence of Romanticism in music was to use music to portray and evoke emotion, to unlock the natural motions of the individual. And you're going to see that is the thrust of Romanticism that hovers over all romantic poetry, romantic novels, literature, music, art, and in some ways still reverberates in modern culture today. the counterculture of contemporary Western society and in America, the Green movement in Europe and in America. Those are all essentially Rousseauian, to get back to nature. Now, what that means and the complicated dimensions of that, we'll see. But in visual art, you can see the influence of the rise of Romantic art and painting. You might want to look at the paintings of David and of Goya in Spanish art, etc. And in literature, Goethe was the first great Romantic novelist in German, but also the Romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Keats, Shelley. So, as you're going to see, what's Romanticism? The idea is to create a form of art which awakens natural sentiment and allows human people to escape from the artificiality, inequality, and emptiness that materialistic, modern, rational, commercial society imposes on us. That cultural movement, again, is still the modern, and the way that I argued in class that modern politics is kind of like an eternalized and internalized debate between Lockeanism and Rousseauianism. Culturally, you'd say the West hovers between sort of like a scientific, commercial materialism and an exhaustion with it and an attempt to escape from it at weekend retreats in cottages. And so the music of passion, the art of passion, because the whole point is to awaken passion. And the way I suggested you could understand that is, it's like the difference between Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre, the two Janes. Jane Austen, if you've ever read Persuasion or Emma. Jane Austen advocates a kind of a conventionalism of mastery over the inner passions and emotional life. And Sense and Sensibility, Austen is kind of arguing that unless you tame your passions, you can't be happy and successful. But Charlotte Bronte, the Bronte sisters, and Emerson, and etc., Thoreau, the American Transcendental movement is essentially an Americanized Romantic movement. And so there the idea is unless you get away from artificial society and release your natural passions, you'll never be happy. Profoundly owing its origins and influence to Rousseau. The educational world was profoundly, especially with Rousseau was a prolific writer. His Confessions, the first and second discourses, the social contract, the Eloise, his novel, but then also his philosophic novel, The Emile, which is about the philosophic tutoring of a young boy named Emile and his partner-to-be, Sophie. The idea that the aim of education is not to impose artificiality, conventionality, and restraint on children, but rather to release through freedom and unstifled creativity their natural potential. That's had a profound influence upon the American educational establishment, primarily through educators like Dewey and Montessori. Now, Montessori schools are kind of an interesting thing if you've ever been to one or if you know of them. But in modern education, the openness to progressivism and everything like that, those are essentially post-Rousseauian echoes about how to educate human beings. The aim is not to conventionalize and socialize students as to make them creative and free individuals. Pure Rousseau. And then the political influence, and this was the point I made in class yesterday, that the left in modern politics, most modern politics and economics, have already suggested that the ultimate platform for Marx is Rousseau, the ultimate platform for Nietzsche is Rousseau. But that tends to be an uncomfortable dialogue. Modern politics, both in Europe and in America, tends to be an uncomfortable dialogue between Lockeanism and Rousseauism. So you have the American Revolution, Lockean and Montesquieuian inspired, versus the French Revolution, which the leaders of the French Revolution, even though Rousseau died about a decade before, or 2 decades actually, before the French Revolution, there's no question that there was a radicalism and an intensity to the French Revolution that wasn't present in the American Revolution. You can explain that away by different historical circumstances, but it's also clear that the different philosophical inspirations of those two revolutions and the Russian Revolution behind it have to do with the philosophic sources of their revolutionary thought. And in some ways in America, that was reflected if you've seen Hamilton, or if you've had courses on American political thought, etc. The tension between Locke and Rousseau is reflected in the tension between Hamilton and Jefferson, and even in some ways in a derivative sense between the Republican and the Democratic parties. Now, our partisan politics are much more complicated than that, to be sure. So let me finish this lecture and not go over the 50-minute limit, or at least excessively over it, by just opening up Rousseau's first publication. This is what made him famous. In 1750, he responded to the Academy of Dijon had a contest for an essays, and his 1750 essay, whether the progress of the arts and sciences has led to an improvement of morals and human happiness. And in this essay, Rousseau says no. In fact, the more that we become more scientific, more commercial, more artificial, more wealthy, more developed along Lockean terms, the more unhappy, more empty, more unequal, more lonely, more artificial and false, more alienated. So the more technological, commercial, and materially comfortable we are, the more locked up in our little isolated, selfish living rooms, enjoying our material comfort, but the emptier, unhappier, and more unvirtuous we are. So Rousseau, in his first writing, seems to be hearkening back to antiquity with his advocacy of virtue and integrity, as opposed to the modern conquest of nature in the creation of comfortable conditions. But in reality, Rousseau does not take us back to the ancients. Rather, he will try to take us forward into a radicalized modernity that will try to cure the very ills unleashed by modern thought and modernity itself. In a rough way, to create a dialogue between Marx and Adam Smith and John Locke, to say that a subsequent radicalized modernity is the cure for earlier modernity is to say that communism is the cure for capitalism. And there you have the Communist Manifesto in one brief sentence. But more about that later, and we'll see you in class on Monday.